And this threat to democracy has made its way to Congress. I mean, my colleague, Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, has said, quote, Christian nationalism is actually a good thing. It is an identity that Republicans need to embrace, and I am being attacked by the godless left because I said I am a proud Christian nationalist, end quote. My colleague, Representative Lauren Boebert, said, quote, the church is supposed to direct the government. The government is not supposed to direct the church. I'm tired of this separation of church and state junk, end quote, junk being the Constitution and Bill of Rights. The Bible itself in 2 Corinthians actually warns us against this. Paul warned against this. He warned us against people who would preach of a Christ that differs from the true Christ that we learn about in the Bible. That's exactly what Christian nationalism is doing. I condemn religious extremism everywhere, globally and domestically, and we have to recognize the threat it poses to our most sacred freedoms and root it out everywhere. And I think it's incumbent, especially upon us as Christians, and me as a Christian, to be at the forefront of the fight to ensure that white nationalism and Christian nationalism doesn't see the light of day. Thank you, and I yield back.
I want to tell all my colleagues here what I told the Republicans in that room last night. I don't believe there are any coincidences in a matter like this. I believe that Scripture, the Bible, is very clear that God is the one that raises up those in authority. He raised up each of you, all of us. And I believe that God has ordained and allowed each one of us to be brought here for this specific moment in this time. This is my belief. I believe that each one of us has a huge responsibility today to use the gifts that God has given us to serve the extraordinary people of this great country, and they deserve it.
The House of Representatives finally has a new speaker, and it's none other than Congressman Mike Johnson of Louisiana, a man with a name so generic it's absolutely forgettable, but also a congressman that many of us have never even heard of. But the things we have heard of him haven't been great. With all of the dysfunction and disruption surrounding the House speakership, when the likes of Steve Scalise and Jim Jordan were at times the frontrunners for the position, the prognosis for the eventual speaker was never going to be great. It seems it was always going to be a situation when Republicans would just get tired of not having a speaker anymore. They would eventually just get tired of having to stay in D.C. to participate in vote after vote. They would eventually want to go home, so they would eventually just say, sure, whatever, this guy.
How does that make you guys look?
Makes us look like a bunch of idiots.
This is petty. This is petty, and I'm getting freaking tired of it.
We're a ship that doesn't have a rudder right now, and I'm thoroughly disappointed in the process.
This is not responsible. We need to elect a speaker.
We've allowed emotion to get in the way of logic.
People are looking for a perfect system. They shouldn't be looking at the U.S. House right now.
And so now we've got Mike Johnson a hop and a skip away from the presidency, a man who now is best known for being an election denier, for being against abortion rights, and for being against gay marriage. And speaking of abortion, he also doesn't like contraceptive. It never made any sense to me how someone could be against both abortion and contraception, especially as a man, but I'm also not a Christian nationalist. Oh yeah, and he's that too, if you couldn't tell. With Johnson's ascension to speakership, the Freedom Caucus has successfully enacted minority rule within the lower house. Members of the Freedom Caucus hold views that are not widely held across the country or even within Congress, and they're known for being boisterous, stubborn, obstructive, and manipulative. Case in point, the Freedom Caucus first obstructed former Speaker Kevin McCarthy's vote into the role until they obtained certain concessions from McCarthy. Then, Freedom Caucus member Matt Gaetz called for his removal when McCarthy acted in a way that Gaetz didn't approve of. When many of the Freedom Caucus members then sided with Democrats to vote for McCarthy's removal, they then tried to install Jim Jordan, one of the worst of them, as Speaker. Jordan would be unable to secure the necessary majority to win the speakership, but eventually they were able to shoehorn Mike Johnson, a lesser-known member, into a very significant leadership role. The Freedom Caucus has now elevated itself and expanded its influence within government, and with that, Christian nationalism now has a place at the congressional table. Several members of the Freedom Caucus are outspoken Christian nationalists. They don't believe in the separation of church and state, and they believe that Christian nationalism should be widely accepted as part of the general Republican platform. Donald Trump seems to be falling in line with this thinking, recently declaring that if he's elected president, he would turn away immigrants who don't like, quote, our religion. This is the same guy who couldn't name a single book in the Bible immediately after claiming that the Bible was his favorite book. When he made the "our religion" comment, he was referring to refugees from Gaza, specifically Muslim refugees from Gaza, not terrorists, not Hamas, just refugees. And he said he'd bring back the Trump travel ban. He was doing the thing that he does when he uses terrorism as an excuse to discriminate against an entire religious group. If you'll recall, Trump tried to ban Muslims from entering the country during his first presidential race back in 2015 until we could, quote, figure out what the hell is going on. Solid plan. And speaking of Gaza, now that the House has a speaker, it can proceed with any pending business. And it's being reported that Johnson has ties with Israel's far right. In 2020, he visited Jerusalem's Temple Mount, and he described it as, quote, the fulfillment of a biblical prophecy. And in the House's first legislative session with the new speaker, the House has declared solidarity with Israel, which honestly was expected even without an evangelical speaker. With a growing number of House Democrats calling for a ceasefire, for aid to be provided to civilians in Gaza and the West Bank, or at the very least for a formal acknowledgement of the Palestinian civilian casualties, the way forward is uncertain. Either way, the situation looks grim. Now, both the House and the Senate have affirmed Israel's right to defend itself against terrorism, and both are pledging to provide military, intelligence, and diplomatic assistance to Israel, though not weapons, at least not yet. So I have a lot of personal grievances with organized religion for a lot of personal reasons, but when it comes to geopolitics, ethnicity and culture are often linked to religion, but it's important to understand that they're not the same thing. While those distinctions can get muddled in some nations, in the US they are significantly more defined. We claim to be a nation that celebrates religious freedom, and for the most part we are. We see all kinds of places of worship. We worship whoever and however we want to without fear of government persecution, and many of us choose not to worship anyone or anything at all. In fact, roughly 30% of Americans claim no religious affiliation, and that number has been steadily increasing for 3 decades. As the far right tries to inflict its evangelical beliefs on an American population that doesn't want them, they'll find themselves having to enforce a minority rule situation, which they seem to be pursuing. They're also making efforts to defund public education and to redirect public tax dollars to private Christian schools. Not only that, but they are encouraging parents to take their children out of public schools and homeschool them instead, and many of the available homeschool curriculums are based in Christian beliefs. So now they're working to sway future generations to adopt their beliefs, but in the meantime, we have people like Gen Z Congressman Maxwell Frost actively working against them. His fight just got a whole lot harder though. All right, that's it for me. If you got anything out of this, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, check out my podcast, Modern Context. Thanks.